Hi, this is Terra Center with our second interview. Here we have today Dr. Elisabeth Schimpfossl, lecturer at Sociology and Politics for Russia at Aston University in Britain. She's also the author of a book called Rich Russians, From Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. And today she's here to talk to us specifically about Russian oligarchs and new censorship in Russia today. So that being said, would you like to add anything to that?
Me? No, thank you very much for having me.
Great. So with that, let's get started into some of the questions. And to do that, let's start with the fall of the Soviet Union, where after that event, a handful of people became very wealthy, and those are the people who we refer to as oligarchs today. Can you explain exactly what type of people got rich after the fall of the Soviet Union, and how exactly they did that? Whether it was a combination of skill and manipulation, or just like a matter of luck and like being in the right place at the right time?
That's a very interesting question. It's also very interesting how you ask it, because you contrasted luck and stealing. And I would rather say it was a combination of luck and stealing in one go. And the people who got rich, it was different, by and large, three different angles. It was people who were very early, very witty and alert to take up the chances to take part in the new market economy that was slowly developing from 91 onwards. There were already some features of it earlier in the late perestroika, but that was the main area. And it was people, for example, among my interviewees, there were billionaires, a classical case, who were studying at very good universities in Moscow and were also influenced by the circle of friends, and kind of figured out very clearly it makes sense to go to China or Singapore, fill up either your travel luggage or your boot in your car, take it back to Moscow and sell those consumer items which were all in deficit in Russia for much larger price. And that allowed quite a number of them. They were very entrepreneurial, and we can't say they were stealing a lot. They were just very clever and in the right age, in the right position, in the right circles to take those chances and make the best out of it. And they later set up also the first banks in Russia, and then were kind of on the orbit of all the privatizations that were going on, and got onto these ranks, not the kind of super rich, but still billionaires. The biggest money was made through a range of privatization processes. There was first the voucher privatization in '92. It was the idea that every citizen, every worker, everybody got a voucher, which was about, back then, $25. And through that voucher had some share, a mini share in a company where they were working, or in another company. And for most people, this voucher seemed completely useless. And also there was a time, it was actually starvation very briefly in '92 in Russia. Germans were shifting in all kind of basic food products. And in this phase, people couldn't understand why they needed those vouchers. And very entrepreneurial and clever people, like for example, Roman Abramovich, figured out very quickly that they could buy up all those vouchers, and in that way take over whole factories, which they did. And for example, Abramovich first steps into his riches happened exactly that way. And basically, kind of into proper stealing we get with privatizations that happened in '95, that were the loan for shares privatizations. By the time the Yeltsin government was completely facing an empty budget, couldn't pay their teachers, their medics, nobody from the state budget. And Yeltsin's popularity was close to zero. The communist leader was about to win, Zyuganov, and he had to somehow get his popularity ratings round if he wanted to become president in the second, remain president for the second term. And what he did was making a deal with the country's major oligarchs. So the oligarchs would give the government large loans, and in exchange for that would get through auctions basically the jewels, the biggest industries in state hands, till then handed over from the government. And those auctions worked in a way that they were completely intransparent and completely rigged. It was run through banks, and basically the oligarchs who organized it, one can say, a little bit sloppily, handed over the biggest assets to themselves, which was then also a thing that delegitimized Russian oligarchic money to an extent that is still considered by the population as highly corrupt and dodgy up to the present day. So that's a kind of a consequence of it. Just the last point, in the 2000s, then there was a massive oil boom, which lasted from 2000 to 2008. And that allowed an additional layer of superage to emerge, thanks to all the oil industry and then the neighboring industries, and also telecommunication, a lot of property industry that was rising and so on. So there are these different layers. And it's impossible to say who stole, who had luck. Luck was certainly part of everybody's enrichment. I better not make a statement about stealing, but there's also something very interesting about luck in the enrichment of the Soviet Union. If you think, for example, Warren Buffett, he's most happy to say, oh, I've just been lucky. My sisters were actually much better than me, but because I was lucky to be male, born in a certain period of time when it was important, and so on and so forth, I've been lucky to make it that far, in contrast to my sisters, for example. Whereas luck in the post-Soviet space is something that has something much more unfair to it. Because it's so much also more linked to, luck is never kind of always, it's never kind of just pure luck. It's also got a social logic to it. And there's a clear logic of who among those strata in society in Russia had the chance to be lucky. And that's also why in Russia, it's not really something people can use to gain legitimacy for themselves. That was a long answer.
It was also a good one. So going a bit off of that, so the Kremlin today, and Putin specifically, is sort of accused of, his government is essentially being accused of being supportive of the oligarchs over average Russian citizens, and that the business environment they create is supportive of the oligarchs and conducive to them becoming even wealthier, and rather than enriching the average Russian citizen. So do you know to what extent this is true, and what exactly the Kremlin does specifically for this?
It's interesting that you're saying that, because from the rise of Putin, it was usually kind of rather the kind of idea that the Putin regime is working against business and against oligarchic interest, or keeps them live in constant fear, especially when Putin came to power and there were first Berezovsky and Kuczynski, two 1990s oligarchs who owned big media assets, media shares, media empires, and were forced out of the country. And then famously Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who in 2003-4 got jailed and spent 10 years in a Siberian prison camp. So since then, there was maybe it's the angle from your generation when you look at Russia. From the 2000 generation observers' perspective, it's always rather been something that the Putin regime is hostile to the business environment. And also responses from people are usually those people kind of, how do they make it at all in this hostile environment, which, as you say, I think you're totally right, it's not at all the case. There was, for example, very important also in the early 2000s, the idea, because Putin brought back a lot of elements that were reminiscent of the Soviet Union, also very clearly, very, very intensely nostalgic of it. Like, for example, at first he reintroduced the Soviet anthem, just with a bit of new text and all these kind of elements. And also this kind of very patriotic gestures all over. But in terms of business, you're totally right. He's never gone off a very neoliberal course. And privatizations in the 2000s that were happening were actually in scale much bigger than those of the 1990s. They were not that scandalous, they were not that game-changing, they didn't produce half a dozen of new oligarchs who were running the country, so they're not so present in our minds, but nevertheless they were just as important and also in a way game-changing. And what you see today in terms of the oligarchs, we've got kind of course, the oligarchs in the 2000s, or the super rich, some people say they were no oligarchs anymore, had to give up a lot of the power they had in the 1990s. In the 1990s, they were basically running the state. And in the 2000s, because of the oil boom, Putin managed to gain back a lot of the power and control over the country, which was at first also very important because in the 1990s it was just anarchy and chaos, and nobody was paying taxes, not in the regions. So every money collected in Russian regions would just never come to treasury in Moscow, and was kind of, it was not sustainable. So through the backed by the oil boom, Putin managed to get control over that, and of course also in order to, because there was so much hatred towards the oligarchs, gained a lot in popularity by slashing out and killing off basically a few oligarchs as good examples. But overall, the policies he's followed have always been very, very neoliberal, which you can see, for example, there was a big scandal, kind of it triggered a lot of discontent in 2000, and now I need to think, I might have the wrong year, 16, 17, when he introduced the pension reform that was a massive step decreasing the living standards and also basically the life people with small pensions anyway, of them to survive. Many people in many professions, their life expectancy was lower than the pension age by that point. And that showed very clearly where Putin, who he is supporting and behind whom he is standing, and also very clearly what kind of economic policy he's ready to carry through if needed. And that was just by a side remark, not to our topic, but it's quite interesting because it triggered a social movement, and it was the first time in post-Soviet Russia that we had people take to the streets, not for their own cause, but in solidarity with other people's causes. So usually you have people, the idea of solidarity, to take to the streets to support someone else has become completely alien to Russians. And that was the first time that that actually happened. So it was, for example, youth who said, we want our grandparents to have a normal old age and not die before they are even able to get, to take their pension, things like that, which was pretty unusual. Coming back to your point about supporting the oligarchs, we could see that just this summer in a case of Potanin, who is again the richest Russian. He was the richest Russian a few years ago and on the Forbes list, and now again. And his biggest company, Norilsk Nickel, released a lot, there was an accident, released a lot of oil into a lake that's going into the Arctic Sea. And that's basically a massive environmental catastrophe. We've hardly read about in the news. And something where Putin kind of took an anti-Potanin oligarch stance in saying he's got to clean up the mess himself, and yet at the same time fully supporting him. It was clear that there will be no serious consequences for that oligarch, and so it was.
Okay, yeah, so today, bringing that, like you touched a lot about on like the power of oligarchs and how that like rose and fell with various time periods. So today, do you think, how much influence would you say that oligarchs have over general Russian politics, whether it be on a regional or a national scale?
They have a big say. So it's very important to distinguish from the say they had in the 1990s. Things are, as I said before, completely different. But of course, they are quite the backbone of the regime. So the regime is happy to sacrifice a few of them if necessary, and has done so over recent years. But nevertheless, they have constant influence. Of course, what comes into play is not necessarily as single players anymore as they did in the 1990s. And there, of course, is a problem that oligarchs are not the best in pulling forces, because every other oligarch is in many ways a rival. So kind of them finding a common policy is quite a tricky thing. But you can more or less say that the business influence that has more or less common interests, which are a bit different when you see the conflicts in the Kremlin between hardcore military elements and so on, they push clearly into a very clear direction of a very liberal, neoliberal economic policy that comes into plays into their hands. There are difference on where the businesses are, to what extent they are linked up with the global economy. Of course, if that is the case, they're very much concerned about sanctions coming in. They're in general very concerned about personal sanctions because that just is kind of the biggest nightmare they can have, which is also quite an interesting thing. So when the EU and the states introduced sanctions, again, economic sanctions against the whole population, Putin could easily, populistically use it in his own favor, whereas individual sanctions onto oligarchs are super efficient. So that in such cases, you can see them trying to gain some influence. Overall, of course, they are nevertheless subordinated. So they're in a tricky situation, because either they fully kind of are at the mercy of the Kremlin, or they need to decide to go to the West, or they fall into sanctions, are in a deadlock anyway. So it's partly a tricky situation, but at the same time, and that is important, however tricky it might be, it's also a very convenient position for them when you consider, I've got in my book data from Credit Suisse, who quotes a study on billionaires, comparing G7 country billionaires and Russian billionaires. And once you're a billionaire in Russia, you are much more likely to remain a billionaire over the next half decade than in a G7 country. So it's pretty safe bet to have big money in Russia. One thing I just want to add, there's also kind of, we often have the idea, and often people ask me about the youth, the children of rich Russians, and a kind of a default idea that they should have an interest in introducing democracy to Russia. And that is kind of a kind of faulty thinking. There are quite a number of people, Western youth, who've gone through the Western education system, some elitist boarding schools in the West and so on, and might have, which is actually quite rare for Russians, might have adopted to all kind of politically correct attitudes, might be relaxed about LGBT, might be relaxed about, or kind of maybe even progressive about gender issues. However, that's rarely the case. There might be not have a big issue about, or kind of not reiterate racist kind of basic attitudes. Basically be quite normal Western people, but at the same time, they're very much in favor of Putin to be re-elected. And that totally makes sense, because many of them were born and grew up under the Putin regime, which for their families meant stability, which for their families meant further enrichment, which for them meant a rosy future. So us expecting them to risk changing the regime around with an uncertain outcome our kind of, or the people who expected our fault in thinking. We can't really expect it for them. And there's another important case. I've just been dealing with it for an article I'm writing. Many of the oligarchs of the 90s, who are considered to be the most Western and most progressive, absolutely adore General Pinochet and his regime in Chile, which he installed in '73, and then the economic policies he carried out. So there's a very clear thinking of free market economic policies take precedence over everything else, and they're very open about that. And if needed, then in order to save the free market, we might have to install a dictatorship in order to ensure that free market will develop. And it's not that they might be thinking in a very cruel way. They are so convinced in an idea that once capitalism is flourishing, everything else will follow and fall in place. So it's for them justified to take dictatorial measures because it will, in the end, be to the benefit of everybody. I leave it to you for now.
Yeah. Okay. So also, let's transition a bit to go and talk about censorship in Russia. So specifically in Russia and post-Soviet states, and one of your papers, Post-Socialist Self-Censorship, Russia, Hungary, and Latvia, you talk about how oligarchs play a role in censoring the media. So exactly what role do oligarchs play in self-censorship, and how does self-censorship look in Russia?
I would say the oligarchs, in a way, play a secondary role. So in contrast to the, sorry about the background noise, in contrast to the Pinochet example, where they were pushing Putin to take similar measures, they are not actually playing a proactive role in installing censorship measures in any way. It's rather that they are so tightly linked to the Kremlin that their empires don't have much chance to, if needed, to silence certain voices they might have happily aired and spread prior to some restrictions. So it's a clear process. So it started with, as I said before, in 2000, when Putin came to power. He was very clever of targeting the media right away and taking off these oligarchs' hands their media empires, Kosinski and Berezovsky, and that was very essential. And in many cases now, there are loyal oligarchs owning the media, but very clearly, whenever there is a conflict, siding with the Kremlin and not with freedom of speech. But what is also interesting here is that it's not, many people have the idea when thinking of Russia that it's completely gone downhill and silence and everything, but there are very many different layers to it. So for example, if you are working for a state-owned or state-aligned, it might be private in some way, but state-aligned, Kremlin-aligned media outlets, you know exactly if you're ready to work in the political department, that you will have to play the game. There's no way not to. But you also know what you're going for before you start it. Then again, if you work in a culture department, you've got a certain freedom that is quite, it doesn't fit to it. So it's not that it's silenced throughout. So it's a political news that are very, very controlled, but in the cultural sphere, you are able to bring across all kind of, even kind of subculture issues or issues about all kind of social problems, all kind of topics that we would think are actually long silenced in Russia. But if it's kind of not considered that important, you have much more freedom in elaborating on more creative things you want to do. And there's also good reason for it. These state-aligned channels have never, it's not a system like in China where you have it all paid by the states, but they are fighting for audiences and ratings and everything. So they also have to keep their audience and entertain their audience. So it's not possible for them to do just kind of state propaganda, because then they would just lose their viewers. So it's a kind of interesting mixture of what is going on. And then you also have in Russia this quite an amazing marginal sphere of young media startups, media projects who are completely fearless in their reporting. One of them is The Insider. You might have heard of them. They work together with Billingate and others on all kind of corruption-related reports, Panama Papers, for example. There are others who had to leave Russia, like Medusa. They had to set up a new outlet in Riga. They couldn't stay in Russia. But there are a lot of media projects that are they're very alert, they're very astute, and they're doing fantastic media reporting. So it's kind of, it's not a desert, and it's not kind of completely dried up. It's quite a complex picture. And so is how self-censorship works. It's not so much that people are silenced, except very clear-cut, as I said before, in for example, politics, related news, but otherwise it's more the self-censorship that comes into force, but not necessarily so much out of fear as you would expect it from Belarus at the moment, for example, but more out of conforming and looking after your own interests and making a peace in a compromise, maybe doing Kremlin loyal stories on one day and then something more subversive the other day, and making your peace with it yourself, that's the kind of right thing to do. Which I think is interesting, because it might be something we might see in the not so far future in Western media as well, where we are so used to, on the one hand, that we can do everything, but it's kind of creaking in everywhere that, of course, we self-censor in the media sector, and with rising populism and restrictions and freedom of speech through the back door, that's not getting any better in these terms. So I think in that way we could learn from Russia and Eastern Europe of how media empires, oligarchic ones, very closely aligned to a government, might easily lead to such features, which of course, in the end, are eroding democracy.
Yeah, and while we're talking about self-censorship, I wanted to broaden the scope of this discussion a little bit. So in that same paper, you discuss how some former Soviet countries like Russia, which you just discussed, Hungary and Poland became more populist, while others, such as the Baltic states, were a lot less vulnerable to populism post-Soviet Union collapse. Why do you think these different sets of countries diverged in this way? And how did that impact what self-censorship looked like in these different sets of countries?
You mean a comparison between the different ones? So Hungary and Russia are the kind of clearest examples where certain quite basic developments are repeating themselves. That's also the thing. So in media study, it's always, might not look relevant for anybody outside it, but in media studies, you have the basic idea that what is going on in post-communist, post-Soviet countries in the media is a legacy from their communist regimes. My colleague with whom I'm working on related issues and I, we claim that might not actually be the case anymore, but rather, and particularly the Putin regime, is running ahead in terms of installing a new populism that we can see now all over the world with a certain delay. And there's the kind of thing, in Russia in '98, there was a financial crisis from which the country recovered then in 2000s, thanks to the oil boom, mostly. But what happened between '98 and 2000 was that the new nascent journalism was going downhill and basically betraying itself. Which, yeah, but parallel, more important to it was then also that after that, big media empires got aligned to the state, forced by Putin. And if you look then to what happened in Hungary 10 years later, we had a big financial crisis. Latvia is not that dissimilar. So we had in Latvia and Hungary, we had all kind of foreign media playing quite a big role in the media landscape. And especially in Latvia, there were the Scandinavian media who had a big mission of establishing a journalism that is absolutely proper kind of following all the rules of what journalists should do, how they should report and so on. There was less the case in Hungary, but journalists were also very engaged. So then happened the 2008 crisis, the economic crisis, and foreign investors retreated. And in both countries, you had domestic oligarchs buying up the media outlets. And that was particularly severe in Hungary, where they were basically super cheap, all these outlets, and on sale for oligarchs who were close to Orban and his new regime, which of course then Orban could easily use to accelerate his new populist regime. So very similar to Russia, you've got an economic crisis, therefore vulnerability in the population, therefore foreign money disappearing, therefore domestic oligarchs who are close to the regime stepping in, and of course then acting also very close to the regime rather to any kind of ideals or values in terms of journalism. And then also then following that, populism rising and freedom of speech decreasing, and all kind of standards in media falling apart and coming to a state where we are now, and Hungary is pretty severe in that case, and we've long seen it normalized almost in, even though it's not a clear cut as Western observers sometimes think, but it's nevertheless kind of going one way in Russia, obviously, in terms of the loss of freedom of speech on a daily basis. Of course, also with journalists being killed and all this kind of stuff coming on top of it. So there's a certain, and my colleague and I, and that's important, we are saying exactly for that, I'm repeating myself now a bit, exactly for that reason, we think it's very important to actually not look at, not taking a kind of an idea of the West is developing a certain way, and now we see whether these Eastern European post-communist, post-Soviet countries are finally falling apart. But we claim at a point where it's rather that Putin is so clearly the first populist regime, and if we look at him and analyze it, we can see a lot. We can learn a lot about Boris Johnson in the UK and Trump in the States. And I'm from Austria, Kurz with his anti-migrant policies in Austria. So it's kind of certain patterns that are clearly repeating themselves.
So thanks. So going back to the oligarchs who control this media, you also have a paper called Russian Philanthropic Capitalism, where you specify that certain Russians like to promote certain sociological and political causes to promote their image in Russia. So why exactly is this phenomenon unique to Russia, and how does their philanthropy differ from philanthropy in the West?
Sorry, say again. I'm saying in the paper that they do what specifically that is different? I didn't.
Oh, that they promote, so that in Russian philanthropic capitalism, that they donate to specific political and sociological causes to promote their image, and that this phenomenon is unique to Russia.
To what causes? I didn't get it out again.
Oh, just general sociological and political causes. So, for example, during the 2014 Olympic Games, a lot of oligarchs donated to Putin in order to build stadiums and other venues.
Oh yeah, that type of is just basically how Russians say a different way of paying your taxes, kind of Russian informal way. It's not so much their main feature, I'd say. Just as background, with the oil boom starting in 2000, rich people in Russia, especially the oligarchs, their philanthropic giving has exploded. of course, in an international comparison, it's still very small. Basically, it went from nothing to quite a bit. But yeah, of course, nowhere there were completely not the tradition of philanthropy, private philanthropy, as there's in the States in the first place. They're giving a specific in certain ways. First, there are, in contrast to a certain kind of Christian Protestant giving, and also giving in the States that's usually done quite publicly, Russians have, from an Orthodox background, the idea you mustn't talk about what you do. At the same time, and it's also related to that, what they do is little strategic. So it should come from your heart and be totally honest. So that also means that they might just do very random things when they just feel like it, be super generous. But of course, there's no any kind of no plan behind what they're doing. And also what they do, that's kind of a certain irony of course, if you're super rich, you don't want to pay taxes, you rather give it to philanthropy because then you can have control over where the money goes to. So the freedom of choice and individualism, the super rich claim for themselves. The result of that in Russia is that everybody's doing the same. And that's now figures in total on private giving, also kind of throughout society, but nevertheless gives you an idea. 90% of private giving goes to children. So there can be a wide range. A lot of orphanages get a lot, especially when someone has kind of an outburst of emotions. There can be, that's also important to much less extent, disadvantaged and disabled children, for example. A lot of money goes to the gifted and talented. They should be fostered and supported because they're the future of the country. But so first, to close that idea, so we've got a certain irony that you've got the freedom of choice, and it's completely, I mean, 90% for children is wonderful, but it also means that a lot of areas in needs are completely ignored by public money, which also shows very clearly a point that many social scientists have raised, that private philanthropy very much risks eroding democracy, because people do whatever they personally think is right. They have to usually, many countries pay less taxes if they do so, sometimes giving government money to support it for the cases where they give the money to. And of course, it's what they see is right, and not at all what, if you ask society democratically on the whole, what people would think they need or where the money should go to. In Russia, children is because there's big distrust in society, and you can trust children, you can't trust grown-ups. And that's one thing. The other thing is also that, well, the future thing about the patriotism, and also because it's also very popular. Nobody will question when you give money to children. But as I said before, a lot of money goes to gifted and talented children, and their important aspect is coming in, and that is quite a social Darwinist attitude. So some interviews were quite clear in telling me that they were even saying, I've got a biological outlook on the world. It's the best of the best we should support because they are our futures, implying basically the rest should drown, which also means if you cause your own misery, for example, prisoners or drug addicts or whatever, then you should just perish anyway. And to some extent, that's even also true for the elderly. There are some oligarchs who look after the elderly, but that's not their main concern. And when it comes to disabled children, I had an interview with an oligarch who built a school for disadvantaged, disabled children of alcoholics mostly, and severely disabled. Nobody in society wants to look after. And he was discouraged from local politicians to do that. This local politician said, why a whole school for disabled children? have 5% for them, take a few photos, put the photos on the website, but then do something proper and not that useless stuff. So there's a kind of very, very harsh, very, very brutal basic attitudes in Russian society. Yeah, then coming back to what they actually asked, the relationship to the Kremlin, those projects, it's a curious thing. So it's almost by default that observers say, but is it honest or is it triggered through Kremlin pressure? And that is actually a kind of a curious thing. Of course, every oligarch has to contribute. And the best is as an oligarch or whatever level you are, if you're on a national level, you need to contribute on a national scale and further down in the hierarchy. If you have already a project you kind of like doing, you're better off, you have greater chances not be allocated something you really don't want to do, which has happened for example, to the oligarch Wechselbau. It's the one who gets sanctioned by the state, individual sanctions a couple of 3 years ago. And he got a project on his kind of unassigned, which it put him into depression because he so much didn't want to do it. Never mind. So you better do something you like in order not to be assigned something you don't want to do. And the Kremlin also does a lot of very useless projects that is basically just PR, outsources it, and those companies call it philanthropy, and if they are state-owned, it might be a lot of taxpayers' money going into it. But the most important here, nevertheless, I would say, is that if people are so skeptic about Kremlin pressure, maybe actually it might make sense, because the Kremlin nevertheless needs to sustain its basic social infrastructure and might have actually a better sense of what is needed than individual oligarchs who divert all their money to give the children and not to healthcare and not to the elderly and not to education and so on and so forth. So it might actually play bizarrely a correcting role. Very undemocratic either way. But of course the Kremlin is very concerned about preserving social cohesion and avoiding any social unrest. That's why also in the current case, I mean, yeah, they're known for taking drastic measures against people who they might consider troublemakers, like Navalny.
So before we wrap up, we just wanted to ask 2 questions specifically about the oligarchs you met. Our first question is, which oligarch did you meet personally? Did you find that your perception of them and the paradigm surrounding them before you met them was drastically different than what they actually were like in person? That their personality is just, there's a huge disparity between what you thought their personality would be and what they actually turned out to be like.
All of them in a way. I mean, there's the example of David Yakubashvili, who that was still in the late 2008 or 2009, and there was still a time when you could get those oligarchs' mobile phone numbers. It was all running very informally. When I collected the second set of my data, it was all kind of formal letters to the secretaries or media representatives. But 2008, 2009, it was running in very strange ways. And a journalist who tasted blood and thought, oh, if I cooperate with Elisabeth, she seems to have some success getting interviews, then we could maybe trade in phone numbers. So I better give her some. And one of them, the phone numbers was David Yakubashvili, who is kind of a person around for basically from the start of the 1990s. And kind of an old, how you call it, a veteran. And he was super nice on the phone. I basically cold called him. He didn't mind, agreed to an interview, was super nice. But then when I met him, it was a very hot summer day, he was absolutely, he was so grumpy. He was in such a bad mood. And then also very different in his behavior as you would expect British or American person to be. He would just not reply to any question. He would just kind of like a little child, just refuse to say anything. I asked him a question and he can, oh, I don't know. I've never thought about that. It was hell. And I perceived him as a very unpleasant person, but then I met him again and he was super friendly and very, very different. And then also when we agreed to, when I asked him what I'm allowed to write about or whether he's agreeing to what bits I'm using from the interview, I talked to him in person rather than through a secretary, and was super charming. So it seemed to me there were a few such cases where it's just kind of another person, when you say surprising me, another person I met, I can't say his name, he just behaved very strangely. I got a lift home from a dinner party in his car, and he would just go silent for 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes reply to my question, and to very, very kind of socially very, not like you would expect a people of certain status to behave. So very not self-controlled and incapable of, and also kind of not caring. So you are low in the hierarchy next to them, and they just couldn't be bothered of whatever impression they create. And that I had a lot. And I also, in that terms, they differ a lot. I feel like, whereas in the UK or in the States, you have to be very nice and generous to those low in the hierarchy by, of course, symbolically putting them in a place, but not rudely. It's very different to Russia, where in Russia you can just kind of live your foibles, live your bad mood, whatever. And it's their way of showing the power of the difference in the hierarchy where you stand when interacting with them. But in total, I must say they were all a bit odd. Don't quote me on that.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have. And thank you so much for joining us. This really means a lot, considering we're a student-run organization. So yeah, thanks for getting back to us, and thanks for being willing to talk with us for almost an hour.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I didn't put you to sleep.
No. It was very interesting.